I roll.
It says we're live.
Hello, everyone. Us bunch of pirates are going to be talking about today about writing your first scenario. A scenario is
It's how I roll.
a scenario is like 4 to 8 hours, or it could be 2 hours. If you don't have the endurance, like Dwayne and Paul, they don't have the endurance to last 4 to 8 hours. So they do short scenarios. And a campaign is a collection of scenarios. But we're going to talk about scenarios today and what it's like to write your first one. If everybody wants to do a quick 2-liners about themselves, about who are they and what do they think about RPGs, go for it. So start with Stephanie, then do Dwayne, then do Reese, and then do Mark. And then maybe do Paul at the end.
All right, sounds good. My name is Stephanie. I've been playing RPGs for about 5-6 years now. I have played a little bit of D&D and then a lot of other games, and I have never written my own scenario from scratch, although I have sort of written my own scenario within a larger campaign that I had purchased and was running. So 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Cool. I am Dwayne Woods, and I've been gaming for over 30 years or so. I'm kind of the opposite of their stuff, that I don't do written modules or adventures. I started out that way, which is a good way to do it. But I don't think I could do one. I don't remember the last one I did. Probably in the 90s. That was actually a written adventure in that sense. So that's me.
Hey y'all, name's Reese. RPGs I've done, but in like video game formats. Tabletop RPGs, honestly, I'll say it's been like the past 5 to 8 years, same. And I've never DM'd. I've never written my own scenario. That whole thing I've never even tried to do.
Tried to do yet.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Mark, you're up, then Paul.
Hi, I'm Mark. I've been playing RPGs for about 2 to 3 years. I haven't really had a lot of GM experience. I've been relying on pre-written scenarios and things and pre-written campaigns for a lot of mine, and also it's been Roll20, so I've only had a handful of in-person times, so not as much experience. But I have used my own written material to bridge from one pre-written piece to another and tried to make that work. So, yeah.
All right, and I'm Paul, and I, like Dwayne, have been gaming various RPGs for over 30 years. I've run both, pre-written campaigns, but primarily like to make up my own. No one can tell me I'm wrong if I do that.
I can, Paul.
Yeah, I can too. Setting yourself up. And I'm Eric. I've been role-playing for 30-odd years. And I've run many written and pre-written. I think the first one I ever did was the Dragonlance in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons as a campaign. I was trying to remember which one, but that was the first one that I ran through that was pre-written. And Ars Magica was the first one that wasn't pre-written. So we're going to talk about what helps make that jump from pre-written, because a lot of people start that way, to kind of like doing the next thing. And both Stephanie and Mark, you both mentioned that you kind of did little bits. So maybe if we start there, because that seems like something manageable. Mark, do you want to start off and give us a sense of what you did? And then Stephanie, do you want to kind of lean in afterwards?
Yeah.
Sure. So it was my first ever GM experience. This was D&D 5e. I had used some pre-written scenario. It was supposed to last from level 1 to 3. And I was kind of trying to do that to see if the group that I was playing with wanted to even play at all. It was like an entirely new group. Some players hadn't even had any RPG experience at all. And there was, I'm trying to remember. So I was trying to segue to a larger pre-written campaign because I still didn't really feel comfortable with like running everything on my own. It still feels kind of daunting now, to be honest. And I used a fight in this pre-written scenario, and I changed it around where there's like this dragon. He was trying to escape, and instead of escaping, the portal that he was going to use to escape actually transported my players into the first kind of starting town of near the first starting town of Princes of the Apocalypse, which is a pre-written campaign in 5e. That had its own pros and cons though, because it kind of like ripped them out of the world that they were in and kind of stuck them into somewhere new that they had no experience in. They were a little bit higher level than they should have been for that area, but we kind of powered through it. But yeah, that's kind of my experience with that.
Cool. Mine was a little bit different, actually. I feel like I completed most of the scenarios that I had purchased for the one area that we were in. This is in RuneQuest that we were playing. And I don't remember now where the advice came from, whether it was like a book or I was chatting with somebody who was talking about how it's important to humanize sometimes the enemies that your players are fighting. And in RuneQuest, it's very much like everybody's against the Lunar Empire and the Lunar Empire is evil. And so I wanted to humanize them a little bit. And also I was sort of planning a long-term, maybe campaign down the road. And so I introduced some new characters. We had a chase scene. There was a little bit of mystery. And I was really excited about my ideas and where it was going. And then I don't really know what happened. I feel like I chickened out and Eric bought this whole new cool book of scenarios and I was like, this looks fun. And so we ended up adventuring in a completely different direction and like left those characters behind, never to speak of them again. And it actually makes me a little bit sad because I liked those characters that I created, and we can get into some of the like difficulties I had with actually just creating characters from scratch, but like who are more than NPCs that are supposed to do more than just sort of, let me clarify. They are NPCs. They're more than just selling them something in a town that they run into. That's something that I haven't explored as deeply. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Stephanie and Mark. Reese, so you haven't run one. This is a bit harsh and like because you haven't run a game before. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Cool. What would help you kind of like get over the hump to maybe write your first scenario, even if you didn't run it? What are the kind of things that will kind of like help you or kind of inspire you to do that? Or even what's holding you back, maybe, is a good question.
There's the hesitance of being in control of everyone, like the intention always being on you. That's probably that's part of it. Another bit is letting things flow versus directing and trying to balance that out. I guess what's stopping me? I would want it to be a grand experience. Like I would want people to have tons of fun, and I don't know if I could guarantee that. I don't know if I could like put on that show.
That's a lot of weight to put on yourself, mate.
Yeah, I was just thinking like that's totally unfair for your players to expect you, your imaginary future players to expect you to deliver all of the fun when it's more like you're delivering simply a tool that they can use to have fun. But if they're just sitting around going, okay, where's the next fight? What's going on? Like there's nothing you can do about it to make that fun. So
yeah, you have to have players that want to help with that. And if you have anyone who's has some experience, they should be the ones to jump in and help that along in any way that they can, whether it's helping out with the rules or how a combat should go, or just keeping things moving along. You don't want people like lifting up their phones and they're thumbing through Twitter while waiting for something to happen. That's on them. They need to help and be a part of that, especially if someone is new. It shouldn't all be on the game master or the DM to make it fun for everyone. There is some of that, and the more experience you get, there might be some of that pressure in there. But especially when you're beginning, you should be able to get a lot of help from the people who are playing it as well.
But you can also help them so much. I mean, the players come to the table and they often don't have a clue what's going to happen in that scenario. So they have nothing to work from. So giving them something to grab onto right away makes it really useful. Like give them a decision like right off the bat. Give them something to hang on to. Where it engages them almost immediately, where they need to make a call, whether it's the old trope is everybody starts in the tavern and then something happens. I'm like, boring. Starting them with like you're standing by a rickety bridge and you hear the howling of wolves behind you. You can climb into the gorge. There's a weird cave over there, or you can cross the bridge. What do you do? Hurry. You can get that kind of scenario where all of a sudden the players are like, well, what do we do? And get them talking to each other. Because that takes the pressure off of the game master hugely. If they're sitting there going, oh, what do we do in this the immediacy of it, particularly in a one shot that's only a couple of hours long, you get momentum right off the bat.
Yeah, I think a good opening I've seen a couple times is the prison breakout. You're all in prison together, and maybe you can actually introduce each character as they get thrown in. And then maybe some random character, not an NPC, picks a lock and says, I'm leaving, you coming? And so again, it's like giving them that massive big hook that you'd use for a shark as opposed to a fish at the beginning is a good way to get started, because it's like most things. It's kind of like improv. Once you've started the scene, the players will start interacting with it. And the more cheekier the players, will actually start running off and doing things before you know what the hell's going on. So cool. Reese, as you go through this, if there's areas you want to dig in, just interrupt and ask questions, yeah?
Okay.
Let's talk about inspirations. Like, where do we get our inspirations from? That seems like a big question, but in fairness, like Paul, you've got some stuff. Where are you going to come from?
Oh, this for me, this is a classic scenario of go and steal something, like whole hog, file the serial numbers off it and make it your own. Like there is no plot device that hasn't been used in a movie that you cannot steal. Put a new coat of paint on and throw it out there. Is it a murder mystery? Is it an action adventure? Is it a horror film? Any one of those, like any genre you can pick, can be translated into an RPG really easily. And then, as long as it's not like dead obvious, most players won't pick up on it. And then you've already got the plot hooks like pre-built for yourself.
Yeah, and don't worry about genre. Like you can take a science fiction and turn it into a fantasy, or vice versa. Like it could be, I know, Crime Watch, and you think, wow, that's crazy. There you got your plot. Literally, you could steal from anything, because I think there's many bits of writing that say there's actually only a number of plots. And we like to all think that we're very different, but there's a very limited number of plots. How about you, Dwayne? Where do you get inspiration from?
Just trying to come at it from a different angle, I guess. Like there's always the TV, the movies, the books that are out there. But whenever I try and think of something, I just try and think of something unique and different and be like, oh, well, that would be a neat scenario to play out for the tonight's session. And since our sessions are generally shorter, we generally play about 3 hours at a time. I can more easily confine it in that way, because there's less of a chance that the players can go off in 3 hours than they can in, say, 6 hours. So it actually helps to rein things in that way. But yeah, just starting things out differently, and don't be afraid to change things up. I've started things in week to week. Say we end one scenario, the next scenario you're in the middle of a Mexican standoff kind of thing. And you can fill in the gaps in between. You don't have to have everything, one thing follows another thing follows another thing. You can stretch out the time, or you can jump time as long as it still makes sense where it happens. I mean, TV does this all the time, episode to episode, it ends, and then a completely new thing happens. So I wouldn't be afraid to play with things like that, play with time, as long as it, you can still make some sense out of it and have an explanation for it. But it keeps things moving from session to session. And that way, it always keeps it a bit exciting in that way.
I find that most of my scenarios start with a mind map. And like say, I'm starting a new game. I'm reading Paranoia at the moment. I'll probably do a pre-gen because it's like an edition I've never done before. But as I read the rules, I'm coming up with ideas. I thought, oh, this would be crazy. Let's do this. So I write for each of the games a scenario I want to do. And the first time I ever run a scenario, I'm trying to teach people how to play the game as well, or, like in that particular mechanic. So like Trudvang, we did at FairyCon. I did some very basic things. Oh, you talk to some people. How does interaction work? Oh, you have a small fight. How does that work? You do a bit of investigation. How does that work? So really, that is very linear. And like the first one, I would start with something linear. Sometimes players will come up with great ideas. Flex it if you feel it, I would say. If you don't feel it, leave it alone. But a lot of my scenarios start with mind maps and probably a map, because I love drawing maps.
Can you explain the mind map idea?
Yeah, so maybe I have one idea. Let's say it's going to be, I really like the idea of them being surrounded by hamsters, the whole group. Like we've done lots of serious scenarios. I want to do something completely ridiculous. So how am I going to get them involved in hamsters? Okay, where do you find hamsters? Pet shops. Maybe it's a wild hamster that's under someone's washing machine. And so I just keep expanding it and drawing it like circles of each idea. It doesn't mean I'm going to use all the ideas, but I just see where my brain lets it go. The other thing I would do is I sleep on it. I was reading a book, this one, in fact, John Cleese on creativity. And he talks about fast brain, slow brain from a book. And he talks about how in writing, you use your slow brain comes up with ideas, but it doesn't give you an idea in words. It gives you a nudge in a direction and like how to be more mindful and pick on that. But yeah.
I really love that suggestion of even just breaking down, creating a scenario into like, there's going to be an interaction, there's going to be a little fight, and there's going to be an investigation. That those are ingredients that would be helpful to create one scenario that could then lead to a campaign, but that you don't have to have the entire background story there first. And that's one of the things that we had talked about when we started putting these videos together, which is, do we do campaign and then scenario and then players? Do we talk about it in that order, or do we talk about it in the order we are doing it, which is scenario first and then creating a campaign? But as I was sort of thinking, I created a scenario within a campaign. I couldn't imagine just creating a scenario from nothing, but that made it sound pretty easy. You just pick a few elements and then you try to stitch them together.
Well, we also all like certain things. Like, Reese, what's your favorite kind of Star Trek episode? What are your favorites? Is it the combat? Is it the discovery? Is it the meeting the new race? What is your favorite?
I like first contact episodes. In general, I like bottle episodes. And then mystery episodes, like ones that had you keep you guessing till the end.
Mm-hmm.
So those are good. That's a good structure. Like, what does that look like? First contact can be crazy because then you can think of like, what cultural aspect they would never expect that we could turn them into. But looking at what we're passionate about and what we enjoy is usually a good place to start, because then you're going to do it with energy and you're going to do it with love. And then you also have a bunch of other things that you can lean on, like, oh shit, I never covered that idea in a scenario, but I do remember that episode that did that. Maybe I'll try that out. How about you, Mark? What kind of films or TV do you like?
I also really like Trek and more of the like mythologically sourced sorts of TVs and movies. So when they don't butcher it, like stories about like what was it? Viking mythology, yeah, like Norse mythology. I really I enjoy the most, and that's got a lot of twists and turns and like things that you don't expect. But what pops out to me in this whole conversation is like when you're talking about these mind maps, like how much, I guess my question is how much of it is kind of cemented down as like this is where you have to take the scenario, and how much of it is improv during the actual play, when you go into it with the actual players.
I'd argue that that's really dependent on who's running the game. There are some people who love the fast and loose. They just have a very basic. I mean, I know people who game, and I've done it myself, where it's just like the only thing I've got planned is one hook, and then it's like, where do the players take it? And then with enough stuff kind of prepped on the side that you can yank it in as you need it. But generally, it's a how do they handle this situation, particularly if you put them into a kind of a moral quandary or a or a thing where you're not quite sure how the players are going to handle it. In which case, then you can run completely improv. That's one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is you can get them on rails hard, where it's the prison scenario is a great one where it's like you are in prison, you got to get out. And in which case you've already set the parameters really tightly for the scenario. So it's a little bit about what you're most comfortable with. I know that most GMs start with a very kind of linear storyline, and that's where a lot of players really chafe at feeling trapped and feeling like they're on rails. So it's a little bit of like, I encourage people to play a little fast and loose and roll with what the characters do, even if it gets you off track. Because again, when you're talking only a couple of hours, you can probably roll with it. And worst case scenario, you toss a combat in, that gives you time to think.
Always a good strategy.
Yes, so combat is worth mentioning here. Combat usually takes a lot longer than you ever imagined it to. And go on, Dwayne.
I was going to say, it's actually, if you think of it as the reverse of video games, in video games, combat can be the quickest thing to do. And whereas in role-playing games, it's often the hardest and longest thing to do. Maybe not the hardest, but it is the longest thing to do. So it's kind of interesting in that sense, and the complete opposite.
Cool. I'm
just going to add, talking with Paul with like the rails versus the getting and fast and loose with it. The one scenario that I did write, I was so excited about it and where it was going, kind of like possible future scenarios. And then, of course, the group didn't do exactly what I planned because I'm not going to tell them exactly, and they don't read the scenario the same way I do. And it was really hard. I don't think I did a very good job of like letting go of that as we played it. And I think I brought that up in the past, that one of the things I had to figure out was when I'm running, a pre-written scenario, that I read it, but there's a good chance that I'm gonna have to improv a whole bunch of stuff because they're gonna go off in a different direction. I feel like I have to relearn that same skill now with writing my own scenarios, and that maybe that suggestion that you're not actually writing a whole scenario, you're actually just writing little pieces of information or an encounter that will appear at some place. That will probably make it easier to not feel so sad when they don't do the things that I was excited about.
Yeah, I would think of it as maybe like writing the setup. So you have everything set up for them. These are the things that are happening, but then the characters walk in and they can change however that setup is and take it in another direction. And like Paul said, like it's something that you just learn over time, is to use a combination of the planning with the improv kind of thing. And it's kind of a dance between them. And it is interesting. And like Paul said, sometimes if it's too linear, players can feel railroaded because they're like, this is the one direction you have to go, and this is the one way to solve it. And then, so players might think, well, why am I here then? If what I do doesn't make a difference, right, then what's the point?
We'll read it.
Yeah, exactly. And you can often come up with way more interesting stories when things start to go off the rails, when things go in a different direction, and it's not things that any of us would normally think of. And I've had this happen many times. So but it does often make it more interesting when things do go wrong, or when things do take a different turn. So if you just sort of go with that, if there's something that you really want to have in there, there's a way to shoehorn things in. There's a way to, sometimes you have a gentle nudge in a different way, or that thing that you were planning, maybe it comes up in a different way. So there are different things that you can do. And then at other points, I ran this Cthulhu one where I had this main dinner scene where everybody was supposed to get together, and there was supposed to be this great reveal and this big tete-a-tete with the bad guy who's sitting at the table. And my players were too smart for it. They're like, no, we're not going to some evil dinner where they're going to like cast some evil spells over us. We're not doing that. And I think I tried it in about 3 different ways to get them to go there. And they just utterly refused every time. So I had to let go of it. And I'm like, okay, it's not happening. It's just not there.
So
then
I was a player in that game. So I can do the flip side of that story. So Dwayne had set up an incredibly horrible bad guy for us to fight. We knew he was unbelievably powerful, way out of our weight class, and we got invited to this dinner where the big reveal was supposed to happen. And literally everybody in the group, I remember, turned to them and were going, "We're going to die if we meet this guy at dinner. Let's hide out in the servants' passageway. That's a way better plan." And it was funny to watch Dwayne kind of go, "Huh." And you could actually see the wheels turning in his head as he's like improvising his way through this. Like, well, okay, well, now you come out here, which is right near the dinner party. And we're like, nope, we're going off that way. And being able to, the fact that Dwayne was able to keep it rolling and keep it moving along. And I do believe you probably kept it going to get through that session for that evening. And then you had to write a whole new plot for the next one, which is probably a good kind of segue point of don't get too far ahead of yourself.
Yeah.
Because the players will do stuff like that. Like just, we're not going into the creepy cavern. We are not going on the haunted spaceship. It doesn't matter what it is. They may go in a different direction. So, plan loosely.
Yeah, that's I would definitely agree with that. Yeah. Try and just go with partly where the players are going. And you can still put your own stuff in there. You'll still get your opportunities each and every time. Just some stuff you got to let go of. So that's all I'd say on that.
Kill your darlings.
Kill your darlings. Yeah. Kill your darlings.
I think also sometimes it's okay for the actual world to move on if your players are not playing. So when I was doing Eclipse phase, I actually had multiple NPCs that the players were likely to encounter, and I'd write blog posts about them. There was a Russian dude who basically his daughter had died. So I was telling his story so that the players could actually read about it. And he was observing the players at different times because he was following the same criminals. So I just carried on and kept blogging about it so that actually I could do some writing that the players weren't necessarily involved, but what it gave the players was a lot more depth in the world that they were living in. But yeah, I think it is important in the end to remember why we're actually playing, and that's to have some fun. Maybe scare the shit out of players sometimes. Like I love doing that for Call of Cthulhu. Has its place.
Yeah, and you said the creepy dinner that Dwayne created was a Cthulhu game too, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
But I mean, I love that idea of consequences and the world moves on. I ran a game where I presented the players in my very first kind of scenario was, there were 2 jobs they could take, one for the town guard, which was hunting down some bandits, and the other was a farmer whose child had gone missing. And they chose to go after the more lucrative bandit contract. But for the rest of the game, that farmer hated them. And I had the child eaten by goblins or something. And it created a level of realism in the game where players suddenly realized, oh, the choices I make matter. It's kind of the opposite of the railroad, right? The railroad is like, these are all the decisions you need to make to get the story done. The opposite is like, well, if I don't make these choices, well, the world still moves on, and it gives it a realism, which I really like.
And maybe we can add that to our bag of ingredients is also like a choice, one or the other. I mean, I know they're always making decisions, but like a choice that the players have to choose in that scenario.
A hard choice, or I mean, I played a campaign with my the scenario broke down to just my wife and her friend were playing, and they were off in a cavern on their own, and they found they've been fighting kobolds. They were very low level, and they found a bunch of baby kobolds wrapped up in a cloak of elvenkind. So I set the scenario out very, very cleanly. if you take the cloak, the babies will die. And so they sat there, they turned their heads and said, well, we know what we're going to do. And I'm like, great, what are you going to do? So I said, well, we stomp the babies to death and we bash them against the wall and we take the cloak and out we go. And I was horrified. I'm like, what? I gave you a moral choice and your answer was to stomp the children to death? But because it was an honest choice and I let them do it, and they came around to say, well, they're evil, they're kobolds, they're going to grow up to be just monsters, so we don't care. But it was an interesting character development for those players, and because I didn't railroad it to say like the gods are displeased and now your spells don't work or something like that, it created this interesting. And then they had this secret that they kept from the rest of the group, and it became a really interesting touch point in the story because just let them have the freedom to make those choices. So set up interesting scenarios and see what the players do, and you find out how murderous your wife is, so it's great.
That doesn't seem like great. So we should record all of these, and it will be the legacy of Paul until Paul's gone.
Yeah, so if I disappear, you'll know exactly what happened to me.
Bashed in for a nice Alvin cloak. Just don't ever get near one of those. Yeah.
Then what we should have is a murder mystery dinner of who killed Paul, and turn
That'll
it
be
into
a short dinner.
Cthulhu game. That Paul's not actually dead; he's actually in the cellar, undead.
That's just the normal weekend for Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, my Lichdom project is coming along really nicely, so just give me a little bit more time.
So other things that I've seen that help for games, I don't know if any of you have seen these, which is like Fabio is a lighter writer's deck. And in there, what it does is has the setup, heroes, and gives you lots of plot points. It's really good for writing, but the thing to remember is that you always make sure your plot adapts. But if you're not sure, there are lots of writer's aids out there that may not be for RPG, but they will certainly help. Another one, I feel like I'm advertising here, is this book called Lazy Dungeon Master, The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Masters. Is a really, really good book. I know Bill used it on audio, but it helps you with running your first scenario and what you should do and everything else in there. So those are a couple of things that are kind of like I found helpful in that context.
Dwayne's got one too.
Yeah, I've so when I was first starting out, so this would have been 89, 90, somewhere in that range. We started out playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Pizza.
Which was awesome. And this particular scenario was called Terror on Rural Route 5. And it was basically the idea that a bunch of mutant farm animals took over a school, I think, and there was some kind of a hostage taking. And I must have ran this scenario, I think at least 3 times or 4 times. And it was just something to try over and over again. And I changed the animals. I think at one point they were all pigs, another point they were all chickens. Eric, that would probably appeal to you.
Chickens are good.
Yeah, exactly. So just the fact of running this simple scenario over and over again several times just got me into that GM mode of just learning how to do it, learning how to run the combat, learning how to have players plan, have players interact. And it wasn't a very good scenario. It was just like a simple tactical one, not much that they had to do, but that was just getting into the mode and just figuring out the different things. And that actually helped a lot at first. So if you can do some just simple written scenarios and just go about it that way, and then you sort of learn the ropes, and even just reading those, you learn like sort of the simple structure that goes along with it. So something like that could help when you're first starting out.
I was trying to find my copy. I'm very jealous. It's like all over there, all those role-playing games.
Yes.
But I obviously haven't put them in alphabetical order. That would have helped. But anyways.
Yeah.
I think that's a good call, what you talked about, Dwayne, about running actually the same scenario multiple times. I have one scenario that I use to teach people how to play Ars Magica, and it goes for all the different elements. And I've probably run it about 10 times for different groups. Sometimes I've run it at cons. And what I really like about it is when you've written something, it's easy to edit. it's like Battlestar Galactica. The first time they did it, good versus bad, black versus white in terms of like evil and everything else. The second time they did it was so much better because it had the ability to kind of like grow beyond that. The other thing I've done a couple of times is run a scenario or a couple of scenarios, and then use that as background. So when you guys played Eclipse Phase, Dwayne, Paul, Steph, in Vancouver, when we played it here, they saw on the news your characters and what they were doing. And it was part of the news, like an asteroid into Mars. It's not really not going to be news, is it? And so actually keeping your scenarios. So one thing I'd say about improv when doing a scenario, and I've definitely done that on occasion, had 1 point, write notes. Like, it's the one thing about improv that they don't tell you is that if you're doing a scenario, you're going to do it a couple of times, make sure you write notes ferociously of what happened, who the names you use, and everything else is the one thing I would say.
Even beyond that, like, I am terrible at taking notes, and I regret it every time I sit down to write the next one, because I usually find that at the end of the night, I'm just like, I'm too tired and I don't feel like writing notes. And then I say I'll do it tomorrow. And then a month later, we're running it again. And I'm like, oh God, I have no idea. I hope the players remember what happened. And they remember who the NPC names are, because I certainly don't. So yes, my advice, which I have not yet taken, is write all the notes. Even when you have ideas about things that would make a good scenario down the road, write them down. Keep your notes organized, not on random pieces of paper that you've now stuffed into a binder. I can attest that is not very helpful.
Yeah, I write a summary after each session, and it might not be that night. It's sometimes it could be almost up to, well, maybe like the day before even. But it does help to do it. I find that when I'm writing my own summary of the previous week, it helps me to remember, because I start to remember the order of how things happened. And then that helps me guide the next one, because I want to remember it more clearly than anyone else. That way, if someone says, well, what about this? I can say yes or no. And sometimes, memory isn't perfect and I get corrected, but it does help a lot to help guide you going forward, I find. And it helps the players too to remember what's going on. And some players will miss that session. So having that summary does help them.
It's interesting, right? Like running scenarios multiple times is also you can always feel free to use something you already know really well as a leg up. I ran a Red Markets campaign, and I set the scenario literally where I live, so I already knew the layout. It was in Vancouver, so I knew where the streets go and where the resources were, and all of those things were already there. So it was just work I didn't have to do. And if you run, say, D&D campaigns, you can reuse that same town over and over again. Unless you're playing with the exact same players, then you already know the NPCs and who they are and what their motivations are. It's just a chunk less work you can do. It doesn't help you your first time out, but if you do something like, I'm setting it in Chicago, I'm setting it in Vancouver, I'm setting it in cottage country where I know the town and the people, huge time saving.
Well, and I know you brought that up in our previous video, and I'm glad you're bringing it up again, because I sort of disregarded it as like, well, so far I've only run fantasy games, so that's not really relevant to me. But I can totally turn my neighborhood into a fantasy neighborhood. It doesn't have to be, like, nobody has to know where I'm setting it. I can just use the layout of River North in Chicago, or, where I grew up in Vancouver, as a fantasy-like base.
Yeah, and then the map's already in your head and ready to go. So, like, I know where the local shop is. I'm not going to go down to I know where the pub is. I know where the park is. And so you can kind of lay those all out in your own head, and just simplifies things immensely. Then you can focus on the weird details you want to throw in. And those are the only bits you have to really learn.
I think finding a passion in something like a city or something else is really cool. Like I played World of Darkness Vampires in Chicago. I never knew 20 years ago that I'd end up living in Chicago now. So when I came to Chicago, it was like, are there really vampires? But like my memory was really strong about all of the places that were vampires. But choosing like C Roots in the chat is talking about using geography as an inspiration as well, which I really, really do like, because I've definitely experienced that multiple times when going through Canada. It's like, wow, look at all those trees, because, I wasn't from Canada. I wasn't used to that many trees. But I think whatever inspires you is a really good place to pull a scenario around because you do a lot more research. When I did Ars Magica in Ireland, I read so many history books around Ireland and that time window because it's very chaotic. And so following your passions is always a good way to have a really good, strong scenario. I was also just thinking, Dwayne, you're nice. You give your players a summary. I ask my players to tell me, what did you do in the last session? And bit by bit, their brains slowly pull it together, particularly if it's like what Stephanie was saying, it's like an hour, a month later. But I always ask them to do that. In some games, what I've also asked them to do is one person blogs it afterwards so that everybody has a record of what it is. Because there's many games I've played where we started playing it, did it for 6 months, then we have someone else GM, and then we go back to it, the same characters. So having that log is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think we've experimented a bit with the other games that are being run. So I think we're talking about a collective blog, say like a Google Doc, where everybody can just sort of add to it as we're going. I think that was one of the things that we're thinking of for our next iteration of a game that's starting up. So so then it's not all on one person to remember what's happening or to be the note taker. It's a little bit of everybody cobbling it together. So yeah, it's an idea.
You know what's interesting? It just kind of occurred to me now, and I'm going to throw it out there because otherwise I will totally forget. Is I think if we could take one of these podcasts and particularly put, say Reese and Mark on the spot and get them to pitch a first scenario.
Hey, that'd be fun.
And that way it's you'll get practice with people who, A, want you to succeed, and B, it'll be hilarious for us because it's great. It'll be a ton of fun. But that way you kind of test it in a protected group. And I've done this with other gaming groups in my past, saying, hey, what if I run a scenario like this? Would that be interesting? And I had a bunch of people go, no, that's horrible. I don't want to set my scenario in 1874 parliamentary debates in Canada. That sounds dull. Let's go do something different.
I want to play that. I want to play that now.
Session ball.
Right.
That's awesome.
I don't want to run that. You're out of luck.
Yeah, with my own experience, it's also, I think, tough to get the players to separate from, like, I don't know if this is derailing too much, but like I'm halfway through, well, not halfway through, I'm partway into a like pre-written campaign, and I want to start writing my own material for this pre-written campaign, but I don't want to take it off the rails to the point where like I can't like bring it back to the story from that campaign. So I feel like I've sort of like put myself in a hole, like where I have to keep like stay there, but then I don't want to like rip my players away from their current characters and then have them like lose that like the bond that they have with those because they're not very experienced and go into a whole new campaign, a whole new scenario. So like, is there any tips or are there any tips or tricks for like kind of changing a campaign that's pre-written into something that you want to like write and then also have control over?
I'd say you're actually in the ideal scenario, like, pardon the expression, but the fact that you're in a pre-written campaign and you know where it has to get back to means you can create like think of it like a side quest in a video game, right? It's they're going to go off here, and when they come out of this, wherever that is, I'm going to put them right back here in the campaign and literally make it a little side thing that they do. It's really handy too if you're running a pre-written campaign and they're not quite at the level you need them to be at. That's the perfect moment to say side quest. And then bring it back. And again, then you still have the structure of the larger pre-written material to fall back on if things kind of go sideways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I need to kind of buck up and not get too afraid that like I'll ruin something in the overarching campaign or story, because it's all up to us, right? Like we're the ones we're driving everything forward, and there is no right answer.
And I guess part of it is what I would say is, does it make you excited to do that? If it makes you excited, you're probably going to get your players excited about it. Even if it is just a side quest or things like that, that's the main thing. Like the GM has a decent amount of pressure on them to guide the story. There are the other players; they do have responsibility. But I mean, if you're jazzed up about it, hopefully they get jazzed up about it too. And the other stuff should hopefully not fall by the wayside, or that they won't feel slighted because you're taking them off in this other direction, be it temporary or permanent. Like I said, sometimes you get a better story out of it when things go in a different direction. And if you are afraid of, like, you know, you're starting out at first, you don't want to derail your bigger plot, then do what Paul said, just have it do a side quest for that one night, and then just bring it back after that. And it's sort of an experiment thing. Well, you might try that and say, like, wow, this is actually better than my actual plot that was going on. Maybe we should just keep following this, and maybe that would get you more excited too, and might get your players more excited. So just try things out. If it doesn't work, then you can just say, oh, it's a side quest, now we're going back to the main story.
I think we also sometimes mythologize writers and people who create these, that they're somehow smarter than we are or more experienced, and we, you know, we're going to ruin something if we try to you know, deviate from what they've done. This is where you, like, fall back on your ego. I'm way smarter than these clowns. I can write my own thing. You know, don't call them clowns because they're probably really nice people. But yeah, but it's that whole idea that yeah, you know, you've got great ideas. I guarantee it. And can pull it off. So a little, you know, a little ego is a good thing.
Oh, if not ego, then just rely on making mistakes and learning from them. I think, like, one of the things that actually the best time to start writing your own stuff is actually when you do have a major campaign that you've already written, and it's taken all that burden off you, and the players have probably got enough hooks or interactions with NPCs that you think, it would be really cool if I explored this one thing with this character here. Or maybe this character, like, maybe you've gone through a bunch of combat and you've got a character that doesn't do combat. Like, actually having a story about them or something that relates to their skill set, I think is a really good change of pace. Because often in writing, they often talk about, how do I change pace? And you see this in Seasons as well, is like, they'll go off and do something batshit crazy. Community was a really good example of that. Like, some of their off pieced was some of the best stuff. I think, like, probably the paintball was the best. But
and
like,
their D&D episodes.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah. But I think whilst you're in a big campaign, doing little bits off explorations to go and do something else allows you to build up very small scenarios that allows you to build confidence to do something else. The other thing to note is the players are not the only players you're going to play with the whole of your life. And so sometimes you write something, you think, oh, this won't match these players, but I'm going to just put it aside. And then when I find the right players, like mischievous, evil, Dolphling Paul kind of style, like, you would love that. So I write that off and do that. Whereas this is deeply thoughtful, probably would change like how people think about it. Dwayne would love that. And then if it's just pirates, Steph would love that. Like, you know, so writing for different types of people, it can be fun in that context.
Reese, I know we haven't heard from you for a while, and I don't have any specific questions, but wondering where you're at with all of this right now.
Just mostly taking it all in, thinking my own stuff. I guess my next little question would be, as far as immersion goes, when you're writing your own things, what do you think your players need to see? Because I've been in different campaigns where my DM will have like little pictures that they'll show us for certain characters that we're trying to understand. And I guess when do you want to show things instead of just telling them?
I think it's and we were discussing this with someone else who's in our group who's brand new to DMing. Shout out to Kyle. We were just saying that I like to see whatever brings out sort of the personality of the new DM. So whatever thing that they like to do to change it up, if they like to show pictures of something, if they like to play some music, if they like to do a little write-up beforehand, which is what I like to do, or Paul, you like to really get into the characters and have some unique, quirky, funny characters. It's all about what you find, what you want to introduce. So it could be adding a picture. It could be like drawing a map or something like that. So it is, I wouldn't say it's cut and dry as to all the different things that you should try and introduce. It's just what fits your personality and your style of DMing. And you might not even know that at first, but you may have an idea like the pictures. So you might have thought, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I should try that. And you might like it, you might not like it, but it's just about trying out different things about what will inject your personality into the game. That's my opinion on it.
I love props. I mean, if I can get miniatures on a table and draw things, and it just makes it easier for me. But I mean, Dwayne had like a torn up piece of map for the Cthulhu game that had to put together, and like, yeah, any props are great as long as they're helpful. And I think the best part about using them is that you'll find out whether your players are engaged very quickly, right? So it doesn't matter what you throw out. If they'll go, oh yeah, it's a map, yay. You're like, okay, cool, I won't do that next time. But no, I've never had a scenario where I have, put something out and somebody's gone, I'm out, and walked out of the game. So not yet, but yeah, try it.
I think players, what's that?
We have a challenge to find the one thing that makes us just leave the room.
Don't tempt me. I'm sure I can do it.
Paul can definitely do that. Yes. Yeah.
I was curious, Reese, what are things that you have enjoyed receiving in a game that has helped it enhance the game for you, or has made it feel like it's slower or not necessary?
I've experienced some of these props. So like the pictures I've seen you do, there are, I think the soundscapes are really cool ideas to draw people into things. I've had that. Oh, I played a pirate game and we had to drink. That made sense. I was into it.
That's unique.
Okay, we didn't have to drink, but like the DM said we had to drink. So
was Eric running that?
It was Steph. It was definitely Steph.
I definitely balanced it. I was like, you have to drink unless you don't want to drink, and then you don't have to. But if you do, then you definitely have to drink. And I put lots of drinks. Yeah, and the sort of characters you're describing, we had when we were at Gen Con last summer, where our GM printed off the picture of the characters plus like their name underneath on three times on the page, where you fold it so that there's three sides and everybody can see the same thing, depending on where they're sitting at the table. And I really liked that because it helped us keep track of the characters and have like a mental image. It also kind of, honestly, I like it because it saves me time because I don't have to describe what the characters look like. I'm just like, here's a picture that I found on the internet that approximates what I was imagining. But then I don't know if that sometimes can take away from the experience of the richness of description. If I'm just like, here's a bunch of people and this is what they look like, feast your eyes.
But I think that falls into, you have different kind of learners, right? Some people are auditory and some people are visual and some people are tactile. And I think mixing that up a little bit to give them those different tools is a great idea. Because yeah, you're not going to make everybody happy with every prop necessarily, but somebody will probably really like it.
Unlike Paul, I like to put things that are not useful to the players. And one of the
red herrings.
Yeah, red herrings are good fun.
I do like red herrings too.
Rumors. Like everyone ends up in a bar at some point, like a tavern, anything else. So I think Mark and Stephanie have seen this once, where I gave you a bunch of rumors that you overhear. It's pieces of paper that I've scribbled up and then written a rumor on them. Now, the interesting thing, some of them are 100% correct. And some of them are about 50% correct. And some of them are like, this is not true in anyone's mind. But if you look just at American politics, people will believe anything. It's not just American, it's British, it's Canadian, it's the whole lot, is actually giving people rumors. And because they're scrunched up, people have to open them. And then they have the tactile thing, coming back to what Paul said about tactile. I think the most important thing for you, Reese, is what helps you deliver on the story, following what Dwayne said. But like, if you go and find a picture of someone, you now have a sense of what that character looks like. And once you have a sense of what that character looks like, you can describe that character better. That means that you're bringing a much more immersive story. Sound definitely does help. Having floor maps definitely of when you're having combat helps people really visualize it. And whether it be a map or is it something you draw out with a projector pen or kind of whiteboard pen, those are kind of helpful as well. But I definitely think it's the NLP stuff, the neuro-linguistic programming, tactile, visual, and auditory is what you're trying to cover. But go with what your style is, what you prefer is definitely the helpful thing. And I would definitely say pictures of characters that are going to stick around is very helpful. Also voices, which Paul's really good at.
Yep.
You should have heard the terrible Scottish accent I was using yesterday for a leprechaun, which made me laugh. But
yeah, fairies are good fun. Just don't piss them off.
Wait, the Irish leprechaun had a Scottish accent?
Yeah, because my Irish accent's terrible. But my Scottish is only slightly less terrible, and my daughter doesn't know the difference. So,
see, I think it's funnier that you had a Scottish leprechaun.
I thought so.
Cool. Reese, ask us another question, and we'll do a round of it, and then we'll finish off. What else do you want to know?
One thing I was like, I'm always confused about is spacing. So like, I guess if you have a visual map, it makes sense. But how do you space characters around each other in a way where like they understand? I guess drawing a picture of it, but a different way of like describing a situation, like describing an event that's happening with people, places in the area. If that makes sense at all? No?
Yeah, theater of the mind as opposed to miniatures.
Yes, that is a better way of putting it.
I think I've got really good at now imagining a room and knowing where people are placed in it, but that's not how it started. I did not start with that. And for combat where things are very dynamic, that's where I would definitely draw it down. But one thing that I would often is when people walk into a place, I always try to remember what does it sound like, what does it smell like, and what does it look like? And those three things will usually stick with a person more than what table am I sat at? What am I drinking? Although the more description, if you do description, be specific. Oh, this ale tastes like manure. You know, that manure that you accidentally ate when your sister shoved your head in it when you were 4, that manure. Like, so actually having real deep specific that goes 1 or 2 levels really gets your players into that space. But I would draw it out. Like, I like drawing maps. So I would draw it out in your head, even if you don't show it to the players.
I would say if you can't draw it out, because I'm a huge fan of the draw thing, is think of it as kind of short, medium, long in terms of distance. So you could say, you know, you round a corner and the monsters are within arm's reach. Then you've set a very like, oh, we are face to face, or for long, you might say something like you hear hunting horns in the distance and you see riders as small specks come over the hillside. Now you've really set a perspective of space and time. Like, what would it take to get there? And if somebody says, "Oh well, I draw my bow," it's like, great, they're out of range now, but they'll be coming close. They'll come closer. And that mid range is, with a couple of steps, I can grapple the robot, or they're coming at you very quickly. So you can do it, but if you think in just those 3 scenarios, it also makes it easier for you. It's like, can they reach them in 1 round, 2 rounds, or 3 rounds? And that way you'll know, and that way the players can have some expectation of how they can react to it. Because if they don't know, it's like, well, is that like, how far is that? It's like, well, just short, medium, long. They're a long way.
That's maybe.
I think. Sorry, go ahead, Steph.
Okay, that's maybe one of the gifts that I will discover of creating my own scenarios. And it's interesting, Reese, that you made that your question, because I was already thinking that the thing that stresses me out the most about pre-written scenarios is, or the thing I really struggle with, is distance. I struggle that in everyday life, I'm just not really good at visualizing what is a foot or a meter or a kilometer, or inches even. Like, I'm not good at visualizing that. And so I know in RuneQuest, we have all these beautiful maps that we're relying on that they've created for us. And every time one of you asks, okay, we're going from this town to this town. How long is it going to take? I have this moment of panic because I'm like, oh God, I can't remember how long it took last time. I know how long I want it to take for this scenario, but I think one time I was like, oh, it'll take 3 days. And you were like, it took a day last time. And I was like, oh shit, I don't know. So I have learned that having an understanding of distance, I know you're talking about more like in a combat situation where it still matters, but that distance on a wider scale can also be helpful to have an idea around before you jump in. So like, you know, if you're walking, how many days is it going to take you to get there versus riding a horse versus whatever, taking a spaceship. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, all of these are answers.
Remember,
sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I was just wanting to bring up, like, there was a scenario where I set up a interrogation and I kind of regretted like putting a map down and having all the characters on like a map with the interrogation, because it kind of implied that there were only certain avenues out of the scenario or of that specific encounter. Whereas if I had just kind of let it be a little bit more freeform, they could have maybe mentioned, are there any windows in the room? That would have sparked an idea in my head to let them escape out the window or something like that. So I feel like in non-combat scenarios, at least, I found that when things are described to me and I can make a vague map in my head of it, but it's not concrete. So it kind of opens up more options that I can kind of accept from the players when they come up with something unique that I want to use.
I feel like I want to interrupt Dwayne now because he's been interrupted 3 times, but
yeah.
Go for it, Dwayne.
I was going to say, like, when you're coming up with a scenario and you want some key information in there and you don't know how to describe it entirely, but you know you want certain things in there, just bullet point those certain things that you absolutely want in the description. You know, if you want to describe, you know, your players go into a room, there's 2 old leather chairs there sitting beside each other. There's a nightstand or a table in the middle, and there's a lit cigarette and an apple with a single bite taken out of it. And you can start without even saying much, you can start picturing that in your head, but then you start asking questions, because just by that description, you can say, like, why is the cigarette lit? Is there someone in there? Did they just leave? And the apple, was it the same person? Was it another person in the same chair? And then you start to get story out of that without even saying that much. And you get the players talking just by what they're seeing in there. And it's just a simple description. And if that's not your thing, if you're finding trouble, just anyone in general, with having a verbal description of it, like I said, write down a few bullet points if you can. If you can do the map thing, if that's your thing, go ahead and do it. If you like to look on the internet for pictures, be like, oh, this is the kind of room that I'm picturing, pull that in, whatever works for you, and just go with that. But I do find that the bullet point one is a very, very simple shorthand way of doing that, of just reminding yourself when you're DMing of things to just add in there.
I think also, depending on the type of scene you're trying to set, also helps.
Yeah.
So sometimes stealing a picture from the internet is really helpful to give you inspiration. So just Googling a bunch of pictures, you don't even have to use it, but then that will go, oh, how would I describe that? Because once you get into the habit of that, like, you start building up a really good space to kind of figure out how you want to kind of describe it. Cool. Thank you for all. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about campaigns and putting campaigns together. And we'll see you then.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.